Hi everyone, and welcome back to our third session of our Women in Jazz series celebrating Women's History Month. My name is Mary and I'm the Jazz Academy Coordinator here at Jazz Arts Group. Today our focus is education, and we have with us two incredible educators from the Columbus area. They're both jazz musicians and have helped us develop some of our programs here at the Jazz Academy. They also both have such a strong passion for developing young women in jazz, and we are so excited to welcome today Rachel Azbell and Mercedes Chomos.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear that pitter-pat? And that happy tune is your step. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street.
Welcome Rachel Azbell and Mercedes Chomos. Thank you both for being here today with us. Mercedes, we'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in music?
Yeah, so I started playing an instrument when I was in elementary school, and my grandfather had been a musician, so we had access to some instruments at home. So I started playing the flute in elementary school, and then when I got to middle school, I kind of looked around, and there was a lot of flute players in my middle school band, but not very many saxophone players, and I thought the saxophone was pretty cool. So my grandfather had a saxophone at home, so I took that and taught myself and started playing. My middle school had a jazz band, and so of course I joined that. And then my high school also did have a jazz band, and really great educators. So my high school directors were professional musicians as well. They played gigs around town. And then when I went away to college, I decided to study audio production, and I got a degree in recording. I decided to go back and become a music educator as well. So I ended up getting a music education degree, and now teach middle school band at Columbus City Schools.
And you just recently finished your Master's of Music Education at Capital University, in which your thesis paper was titled Decreasing the Gender Disparity in Jazz Through the Single-Gendered Classroom. With your research paper, you talked a lot about the history of women in jazz and kind of the struggles that they went through and what it was like. Can you talk a little bit about that history of women in jazz?
Yeah, so women have been playing music, way before jazz. And unfortunately, the beginning of jazz back in the early 1900s wasn't really a place for women. So I don't think women were intentionally left out. Like, it wasn't this big plan that we should exclude women from jazz. But the way jazz was developing in brothels and in nightclubs, this just wasn't the reputation that women wanted to be associated with. And jazz didn't have a great reputation in the beginning. It was about taking care of their family and maintaining the home. And to go out at night to go play an instrument, really, there wasn't a place for them. And they would really be criticized if they chose to take that path. And then as jazz developed and there was more focus on improvisation, women weren't having that opportunity to learn to improvise as well, because this was taking place at nightclubs, and this was taking place maybe places that weren't even safe for women to be traveling. So again, they really weren't given the opportunity to learn or play or perform or be part of the group. Now, when men went off to World War II, there was all these jobs available for women in lots of fields, not just in music. And so women had the opportunity to take the place of male musicians on the bandstand. And this was a great opportunity for them, because now they were actually able to show their talent. So although they've been playing music all of this time, they're able to perform. And, that wasn't as easy and as great as it sounds, because now they are still expected to maintain that reputation of these housewives and these women that have, that they're just these nice girls next door, but they're playing instruments. And so they're expected to wear these costumes. They're really doing two jobs. They're expected to look glamorous, but they're also expected to play really well. And unfortunately, the glamour was the first priority. So even auditioning for some of the all-female bands that existed in the time, they were judged on their appearance first. And then they were also expected to play like men. Men were expected, or we just assumed that men were good players, but the ladies really had to prove it. And they really had much more work to do and much more to prove just to compare. And they got some recognition, but obviously not very lasting, because there are few female musicians or instrumentalists that people can name this day, even though some of them did play with Dizzy Gillespie. After the war, the men returned home, and the women were expected to just go back to their houses and stop playing and give those guys their jobs back. They really didn't have a place to perform anymore, and a lot of them just kind of faded away and didn't get the recognition that they deserved in jazz history.
And that was one of the biggest points I took away from your paper, that the women, they weren't regarded as musicians. They were just filling the void for the men when they were gone. And when they came back, that was it. They were done. So thank you for sharing all of that. Rachel, we'll jump to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in music?
Yeah, so I am from Lancaster, Ohio. My grandma was a pianist and a saxophonist, and after she passed when I was in high school, I learned that my great-grandfather was involved in jazz and actually was a band leader in the Central Ohio area, and that really struck me. I had just started singing jazz in school, and I suddenly felt very connected to it. Because I was very close with my grandmother, and I essentially started music because I wanted to be like her. I saw a lot of myself in her, especially as it came to the piano. So in high school, I started to sing, and I was very focused on musical theater. I studied opera. Of course, I liked pop music, and I started to sing jazz, but it wasn't something that I think I understood literally existed today as a career until I was in college. And once I got into college, I eventually landed at Denison University, which is where I finished my Bachelor of Arts in 2015. I was exposed to a lot of different types of music, and I settled on jazz. So now I'm in Texas, actually. I'm in my second year of my master's degree at the University of North Texas. And it's been a ride. It's been a crazy time, and I feel very grateful to be doing my degree here.
And along with your amazing performing, you're an outstanding educator. You actually created our vocal jazz program here at Jazz Arts Group. One question we wanted to ask you: we know historically women weren't accepted as instrumentalists, and it was more widely seen for women to be singers with a band. Do you think that expectation still exists today, where women are more widely seen as singers in the jazz community?
I think it's quite a complex issue. I think it has to do with what happens when you're in middle school and you're choosing instruments. And I think in my experience, I can't speak, in terms of everyone's experiences. Most of the time, singing is seen as an activity for female musicians, and I think other instruments are seen as being deemed for male musicians. I do think the issue persists today, and it's definitely on an individual level, meaning like, what was my mom and dad saying? What were my mom and dad saying? What were like my peers saying? What was my teacher saying to me when I was choosing these instruments? And that really sets the path for your whole life. As a musician, that moment cannot be understated, of like choosing the instruments and like, will I do band or choir? And like that literally changes a kid's life forever. And I think it definitely is an issue today, but I think with the work of people like Mercedes and hopefully myself, eventually we can work to navigate towards a clear, like, hey, all instruments are meant for all people, and sort of spread the love of singing and playing instruments to all
to all genders.
What you said was so true about the younger students, and why that instrument selection process is so important when they are younger. So those younger students, they're not as self-conscious, and they're kind of more willing to take a step that might to us seem gendered, right? So we know that there is this gendering of instruments. We see the flute and the clarinet and the piano and the violin as female instruments. And then on the other end, we see trombone and tuba, percussion, right, Mary, as male instruments. And in the middle, the saxophone kind of falls in the middle. So when we aren't seeing, and when young students aren't seeing women play those male instruments, they don't see themselves playing it. They don't have a picture. They can't imagine themselves playing those instruments because we haven't presented those images to them. So they don't even consider that it's an option. They don't even know that it exists. So starting really young, even before kids start playing instruments, when we think to those elementary music classrooms and we're showing videos, or you have somebody come in and present, if they're only seeing a jazz band of male musicians, they wouldn't even know that a girl does play the trombone. They wouldn't even have that, they wouldn't consider that.
Yeah, and I think that's such a huge point that you touched on of what we introduce kids to early on. And my experience I was a percussionist growing up, and I remember always having the thought that I was one of the only females, and I think this really did a lot for my upbringing and history in it. So I think that's a really important thing to touch on. Aside from showing young students, these young impressionable students, what they can expect and showing them diversity, are there any other specific teaching tactics that we should be doing as educators? Anything else that would help normalize this gender disparity in music in general?
I think directors need to be very intentional about the recruitment process. So I don't think directors are discriminating when they are, when students go through the process of picking an instrument. I don't think they are necessarily getting girls to pick the flute. I don't think they're doing that deliberately. But I think directors could do a better job of encouraging girls to play those male associated instruments. And so I think approaching it with more like seeing the end in sight. And we know that not all of our students are going to end up as professional musicians, but to increase the numbers in the end, we really have to start when they're young and they're picking those instruments and deciding, okay, what do I want to maybe do in the future? Where do I want to go with this? Do I want to be a recording engineer? Do I want to be a music therapist? Is it possible I want to teach? And that's hard for a fifth grader to say, but band directors are often most concerned with instrumentation, right? Okay, we need to have a good balance in our band, but maybe approaching it from the other direction of, okay, yes, I need to have a good balance, but maybe also in the trombone section or the baritones or percussion, let's have that more evenly distributed with those girls, so that when those girls move on to high school, that they're surrounded by others that look like them and have similar experiences to themselves, because that gets even smaller in college. And then when they leave college and they go on to a professional life, they're looking back on these experiences, and were they sitting looking around with others that look like them or not? And usually the case is they really weren't. There weren't other girls in the band with them.
And it's interesting because at JAG, in my teaching through the Jazz Arts Group, I have worked with and do work with different ages. And then of course I'm a teaching fellow here. So then I'm working with young adult people. So it's just interesting to see how over time students carry this thing in different ways, you know, how it progresses and how it creates those roadblocks if there has been an experience that's impacted them in a way that has put them in a position where they don't feel like they had the option to choose something else, you know? So it's interesting to just see how it changes over time and as the students progress in school. But yeah.
I think it's important for me as an educator to share my information with other educators and really letting other directors know the consequences of their actions or their inaction based on putting the right instruments in kids' hands. And sometimes I feel like directors have all of these rules. Well, we can't start saxophone in elementary school because it's too big, or we don't start drums, we only start bells, right? And we kind of limit it. And so I really, I try to talk to all the directors I can about, really think about your instrument fitting process and getting those instruments into the hands of girls and how you're doing that. And I just think a lot of directors don't consider this. They just don't think about it because maybe, most of our middle school and high school directors, band directors, are male. And so, again, I don't put any blame on them. I don't think they're doing something wrong. But from their perspective, they don't even consider the effects of these choices that the kids are making at a young age.
I think you guys are both spot on. I think it really is so important for these directors and these teachers of young children to be intentional in what they're doing. And if that means going above and beyond to show more females playing these instruments or fostering that that courage that they see right away in these young females, that's so important. And one little moment can really affect the rest of their life. So it's really, really important. So given all that we know about the history of women in jazz and what their role was, is it important to talk about these issues in current day? Before I learned more, my approach would be to ignore talking about it, just work to normalize it by not over talking about gender inequality in jazz, just see musicians for who they are and not talk about the difference of male, female, whatever. What are your guys' opinions on if we should have these discussions or we should just let the music speak for itself? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's also a very loaded question, I think. The more I've been around other female musicians that play jazz, I too have had an evolving opinion about this. I believe fiercely in discussing it and acknowledging its existence, because if you don't, as an educator, in my opinion, you're letting your students down, I think. And maybe people disagree with me, and that is totally valid. I think it has to definitely be the right age and the right context, but I'm thinking about high school and college age students specifically. I feel a responsibility to acknowledge that to be in existence, particularly because I teach vocalists and we have our own unique set of things that we navigate. So in my opinion, yes, I think it's very important to acknowledge it, but it has to be the right environment. You don't just want to be inflammatory just to be inflammatory, and you really just have to be thoughtful about it. And I think if you're thoughtful about it, that's going to pay off in dividends in the students' later musical life, should they choose that path for themselves.
I think because ultimately, musicians want to be treated equally, and the female musicians don't want that attention of being different. They just want to show up and make music like everybody else. And so as important it is to always, I think talking about the topic is necessary, but I think a lot of people, especially women, are like, okay, let's just get past this. Like, why are we still talking about women in music? Like, we're everywhere, like, this isn't anything new. Women are everywhere. So let's just get on and let us make music like everybody else. And that's such a simplification of this huge topic. But, it is still really important to talk about. And it's, at this point, still essential to talk about.
I want to add, my experience in the jam session, which was where I quite literally learned how to exist in jazz in Columbus. I equipped myself. I put the armor that I have and had in those experiences was my musicianship, my ability to do the thing that I came to do and to be confident about it. And of course, it's important to address the social issues of jazz, but at the end of the day, the the best way, in my opinion, to combat it is with undeniable musicianship, the courage to just try and the confidence to do it. And in my opinion, in my experience, that has helped me persevere and want to come back to it, you know, despite the hardships of the social environment around jazz. It's not so much as like, let's sit down and talk about misogyny, right? It's more like, hey, I want you to be equipped with this piece of advice before I put you in this environment, you know, the jam session being one. I want my students to go into a jam session and feel like I'm ready to go. I'm here to sing. I'm going to be successful. And I don't want them to be put off by the environment that they may or may not encounter. So that's how I've gone about it so far, and my experiences that I have had, if that makes sense, if that answers your question.
I think that's so smart and so important. Instead of focusing on the negative side of that, you're instead creating these strong individuals and equipping them with the tools they need to not even think about the difference between male or female, but just to be strong musicians. And I think that's really important. That's a great way to focus on the positive of it.
Right. So that I want to add that because I think it is important to have that discussion, but what happens next, you know, because there has to be that, okay, let's get on with the music, right? And to me, the best way is to just be really on top of your game and, you know, wanting to be there, of course, to socialize and foster that community that jazz has, but you have to have the musicianship like be undeniable because it will inevitably be questioned. Even if it's in your own brain, right? It will be questioned.
Right,
So,
you can't have it both ways, right? You have
right.
to be able to hold your own. You have to be a quality performer in the end, right? Because we can't then turn it back around and be like, well, I look cute today, so that's going to get me by, right? That's what we're saying we don't want to have happen. And what was expected of these women, you know, back in the beginning of jazz, they were expected to look so cute and nice. So at this point, you know, we just need to play as well as, or sing as well as the person next to us. But Rachel makes a good point, and she's listing all these characteristics about herself, which show a lot of strength, right? And self-confidence and determination. And I think that those characteristics are necessary.
Well, I think, and I know that both of you have done incredible things and made incredible contributions to this issue and moving us forward. And I thank you on a personal level, and we appreciate you so much from Jazz Arts Group and everything that you do for this issue and just moving us forward and making it what we know it can be. So thank you both so much for talking today and for all of your insight and knowledge. Thank you so much.
And that happy tune is your step. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street.